All right, kiddies. I know I've said it before, but it's time to start my favorite topic in biology. Now, I know I had said genetics was my favorite, and DNA was my favorite, and ecology was my favorite. But if you take all of those topics and tie them in together, it's evolution. And this really is kind of the summative be all end all of biology, that it helps to explain all the things we've learned in biology. It's the unifying theme. So let's dive in head first, shall we? Now, if we look at what evolution is in its simplest sense, it literally means change over time. Now, two components here: the fact that something or someone or some organisms or an object, something, is changing over time. And the time is the part that really throws people for a loop. We're not talking 2 minutes, 5 minutes, a day, a week. We're talking years and years, tens of thousands, and in some cases millions of years. So that's what we want to try and figure out. How do organisms evolve and change over time? Because this is a very controversial topic in many groups around the country and around the world. So to start with, we really have to look at, now I've misled you here. I said the theory of evolution, it's credited mainly to a guy named, my boy, Charles Darwin. Now we got to be careful here. The idea of evolution had existed for centuries before Charles Darwin. But he's often the poster child, if you will, for this, and we're going to see why in a second. And what really happens is that this guy, this strapping young buck, in 1831 from England, was nominated or volunteered to sail as a naturalist. Fancy way for saying an environmental biologist, someone that goes out in the field and observes and collects bugs and plants and makes observations, kind of a catchphrase for this type of scientist. But he was nominated at a very young age, his early 20s, to sail aboard this research vessel, the HMS Beagle. Now this ship, its main purpose was to sail around the world in mapping coastlines and looking at other cultures. And they asked Charles Darwin to go aboard because they wanted a scientist there to help them study nature, hence the naturalist. And this was right up Charles Darwin's alley. He wasn't particularly really all that great at school. He was okay, but you know, school wasn't his thing. Being trapped in a desk in a room when he'd rather be outside collecting beetles and looking at plants, as we said, and just strolling around doing the outdoors thing. He was really, really good at it. So why not? He jumped at the chance to go and do that, so he accepted, and off they went. Now, when we look at where they went, as we said, they started from England, and we can see that they spent a great deal of time here around the coast of South America, in particular these famous islands here we'll see, and ended up circumnavigating the globe, stopping at various locations. And what they would do is drop Charles Darwin off and say, hey, here you go, we'll pick you up in 2 days, go do your thing. Go collect birds, go collect plants, go look at fossils, go make sketches, etc. We'll leave you with a team of other gentlemen with laborers, and go get it done. And we'll do this around the world. And interestingly enough, side note, it was only supposed to take 2 years, but as we can see, it actually took 5. But he was in his element. He got to do exactly what he wanted to do. Now, some of the things he did see that really puzzled him, which are really, really strange here. He noticed there was he saw this everywhere, a huge variety, diversity among organisms. Like in this image here, we can see that in these ladybird beetles, or these ladybugs, if you will, none of them are exactly the same. They're the same species, they have similar characteristics, but they differ slightly in size and in particular in their markings that are on their coverings above their wings, on their backs, for lack of a better term. And this is just one example, but everywhere he went, with plants, with birds, with insects, with everything, there was diversity. Everything was a little bit different. He also saw, and this really made him go, everywhere he went, he saw plants and animals that seemed well adapted, like they were perfect fits for their environments. Now, although Charles Darwin didn't go anywhere cold, he certainly didn't see organisms such as these guys. But here's a great example of that: an Arctic fox. Stop and think for a second. Ask yourself, what physical traits does this guy have that make him well suited to that environment? If you think, obviously, look, he has thick fur, help keep him warm. The coloration of his fur for camouflage, both for protection and for hunting. I mean, it's uncanny. He's just amazingly fit in with that environment. Quickly, some other examples. We can see here, if you look at this, there's a fish, and not any kind of fish, a type of member of the flounder family. You can see this is perfectly fit in and adapted for its environment, both in its coloration to blend in, which it actually can change through special pigmented cells, also its body shape, flattened so that it can hug the bottom floor to hide for predators, eyes on top of its head. The design, if you will, although I hesitate to use that term, makes this critter excellent for its environment. One final one here, which we do have here in Rhode Island, a great blue heron. Now, this one's a little bit more subtle in its adaptations, but stop and think for a second. What features, what physical traits does this organism have that make it very well adapted for its environment and its lifestyle? Right here, right here, right here, right here. I mean, he's a perfect fit for that. But anyway, back to Charles Darwin. He noticed all the wildlife, and something else he noticed in his observations over these years. He collected tens of thousands of fossils. Now think about what a fossil is. When an organism dies, if we're lucky, that organism is buried in sedimentary layers of silt and mud and rock, etc., and becomes hardened, mineralized, so that we are left over with an imprint, in some cases bones, calcium-based structures for that organism in the sediment. And okay, well, so what? Why did that bother Darwin? Well, he thought, like in the example right here, wait a minute, is that a fish? It looks kind of like the fish we have today, but we certainly don't have those alive today. Or if we have, I haven't seen them. So it's fish-like, but it's different. And why isn't that thing alive today? What happened to make it no longer exist? These things puzzled Darwin immensely. And again with the fossils. Another thing really quickly, this idea of biogeography. He found organisms that were similar, but yet living in totally different environments in different parts of the world. These are all types of insects. And as you can see, they're similar, but yet they're different. They all belong to the same genus, Andrena, but they're different species. And some of them, for instance, these two may live in North America while these two live in Africa. Why? Why do they live in different environments? Why don't these live in Africa, and why don't these live in North America? And again, this is just a fake example, but that bothered Darwin. But perhaps his most famous stop was at a series of islands off the coast of South America, off the coast of Ecuador, called the Galapagos Islands, which I think most of you have heard of. A series of fairly small volcanic islands that are very close together, that he hopped from island to island. And here's where he really got crazy, if you will, because he noticed the flora and fauna, the animals and plants on each island, were different from island to island. And his most famous example are finches, but he noticed these with various plants, with tortoises, even with birds, etc. Why were, a great example here, which we'll be looking at closely, finches? These small birds that are different species, but they all turn out to be finches, and each one of them varied in their size, their form, and in their functions. Each one in particular had different beak styles that let them fit in and have, as we can see here, different food styles because of different feeding styles. And also feeding locations. So each bird, if you will, fit into its niche or its niche based on its place, based on its physical characteristics. And that really bothered Darwin. Why? Why are they like that? Why are they so perfectly fit in? And why don't I find this bird eating the same things as this bird? And vice versa. Really, really bothered him. So we have to keep in mind that Darwin can't take all the credit for this. Like we said, some of these theories of change over time were around long before him, so he actually read a lot of books, talked to a lot of other scientists, and if you will, stole some of his ideas from those scientists. For example, there were geologists, two geologists, Hutton and Lyell, who wrote books and proposed that the Earth is thousands of millions of years old, not 4,000 years old, 6,000 years old like people thought. And they had evidence with mountains and volcanoes and earthquakes. lava flows, rivers, sedimentation, erosion, that the earth is constantly changing, reforming, and reshaping itself. Darwin loved that idea. He thought, well, wait a minute, that's great, because if all the animals and plants are living on the earth and the earth is changing, maybe the organisms change too. Interesting. Gradual change over time. Another one was actually a mathematician named Malthus who, through a series of observations and complex math, figured out that populations can only grow so big, which we saw in our earlier studies of ecology, before they level off and they die out. That basically there's not enough food and resources to go around, so there's a constant struggle and competition. Organisms are going to die off. If you can't get your food and your resources, you're going to die. Darwin loved that idea also. And still yet another guy, Jean-Baptiste Lemaire, I just like to say it that way, sorry, who came up with an interesting idea that organisms acquire traits through use and disuse of parts, and then they pass those traits on to their offspring. Which Darwin liked the idea, but the only thing that's wrong with it is that it's wrong. Quickly looking at that example, Lamarck's idea of giraffes. He said that originally an ancestor had a shorter neck, but they had to keep stretching and reaching to reach vegetation, so their necks got a little longer. And then when they had offspring, their offspring had longer necks. It was driven by an inner need. Now we know that's not the case today, and you know also that traits are acquired because of genetics, what's passed down. So even though this was wrong, Darwin liked the idea. So eventually he got all of his findings, came back to England, and many years later published a lengthy book called The Origin of Species. And he waited quite a while to write that book because he knew it was going to cause controversy. And this is given credit. This is where he proposed his theory on how evolution could work. Because remember, evolution had been around for a while. And he based it on his idea of, or used a lot of ideas that were already around, and one of them was called artificial selection. And he gave countless examples, and he said, look, to the people reading the book, we as humans artificially select traits in crops and in pigeons, even in dogs is a great example, that over the last 10,000 years, humans have been selectively breeding dogs, picking out the traits they want. If I want a dog that's really big, I'm going to mate two larger dogs so that hopefully the babies are larger. If I like smaller traits, I'm only going to pick and mate the dogs that are smaller in their traits. So we gave a lot of examples of that, and ultimately what we want to end with is his theory. And we'll spend a lot of time looking at this. It was called natural selection. Now really quickly, in its simplest form, this theory was composed of three parts. In it, he said the first one is that there's variation in nature. All organisms are born a little bit different and live in different areas. Now he didn't know about genetics, but we know today that you have different traits. All organisms have different traits based on their genes. Essentially, everybody and everything is born a little bit different. And he went on in the middle of the book to say, and if you accept that idea, this is where the Thomas Malthus comes in, organisms, there's a struggle for survival and a struggle for resources. Organisms have way more offspring than can survive. Basically, your survival is dependent on getting these these resources. Now here's a cluster of frog eggs. One mass. Not all those frogs are going to survive. Only some of them. Some will be eaten. Some will starve. Darwin knew this. And he said everybody's born different and everybody's competing for resources. And if you take those two things together, the last part to sum that up is that Darwin never used this term, but here's essentially the idea that people have used to coin this phrase: survival of the fittest. Organisms with the better traits that make them better suited to their environments are going to survive and have more offspring. And those offspring will have those traits. Less favorable traits end up dying off and eventually could be lost from the population. And here it is, we can end with this simplified viewpoint here that I can leave you that really sums up natural selection in a nutshell. Different colored beetles, let's say these birds that are eating them only eat green beetles. Think about what would happen to that population eventually. Obviously, if they keep just eating green and they don't eat these light brown colored, tan colored beetles, these guys survive, the green ones die out, and eventually that population would have no more green beetles. There would just be these tan, peach, salmon colored beetles left. And he said, that's it. That's natural selection in its simplest form. It's not evolution, but it's a way that evolution can occur. What can cause evolution? Very simple.